as central banks have become more and more powerful, they've also become extremely prominent in financial markets, and I think that makes them inherently political because they're in a position to steer financial rewards to some members of society at the expense of others. The Fed has been complicit with a deficit spending Congress and White House. And I sometimes think, if you ask someone, do you think the United States will still be here in 50 years? It's troubling that they almost have to think about it. And we hear so much about fiscal unsustainability. And if we're serious, what we mean is that's an existential threat. This is an important time for Congress to look at reforming the Fed. We should be every bit as concerned about power that has been placed in the hands of our monetary officials. The Fed is in a position to circumscribe the economic agenda of an incoming president. So the Fed is not the little guy if there's a battle of wills over how to achieve economic objectives. I'm uncomfortable that the Fed is in such a position to undermine the ability of an elected president to carry out his economic agenda. Congress needs to look at whether the Fed should be allowed to have no limits on the amount of government debt it can purchase, no limits on the amount of base money it can create with a keystroke, no limits on the amount of interest payments it can give to commercial banks and money market mutual funds at the expense of taxpayers, I might note. I think that the Fed has become too prominent, too powerful, and in that sense, too political.
This Kitco News interview is brought to you by Goldback, inflation-resistant, 24-karat gold currency.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy Szafron. You're watching Kitco News. Today we're diving into some of the most pressing issues facing the U.S. economy and the global currency system. Rising debt levels, both here in the U.S. and globally, are reaching critical heights. Now, inflation is squeezing wallets, the value of the dollar is under pressure, and we're seeing a fast-growing trend towards de-dollarizations. Nations worldwide, especially the BRICS bloc, are looking to bypass the dollar by trading in their own national currencies, and they're even discussing a common currency backed by gold. Here in the United States, national debt is fast approaching $36 trillion, and servicing this debt costs taxpayers billions of dollars every year. And globally, as trust in the dollar wavers, it's clear that we need real solutions to restore financial stability. And this is why the idea of sound money is more relevant than ever. Our guest today, Dr. Judy Shelton, is here to talk about precisely that. Dr. Shelton is a monetary economist and a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and a former economic advisor to President Donald Trump. Now, she's also the author of The Coming Soviet Crash, Money Meltdown, and her latest book, Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. In Good as Gold, Dr. Shelton delivered a powerful argument. For money to truly serve society, it must act as an honest measure, a stable, reliable store of value. Now, she suggests that our reliance on government-issued fiat currency has led to mistrust in the dollar itself. And in her words, future money should be, quote, as good as gold, or perhaps even better. Let's dive into this important discussion now. Dr. Judy Shelton, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Now, in your book, you argue that monetary value should not hinge on manipulated interest rates or inflation targets set by central banks. Instead, money should be as trustworthy as gold itself. You wrote, quote, money should work for every citizen the same way. Now, to start off, I'm curious here, Dr. Judy, can you unpack for our viewers the situation we find ourselves in now, which, of course, is more than half a century since the United States government broke the official link between the dollar and gold through convertibility at a fixed rate? Talk to us about the main problems that have developed since then.
I think the main problem is the lack of discipline in the budgetary aspect of government control. That feeds into monetary policy. And what we've seen since, as you said, over 50 years before, when we were still on a system that had the dollar as an anchor, what we've seen is kind of a falling away from that basic function of money, which was to provide a stable foundation for economic activity. And that's what works best for a free market economy. But I think what has happened as central banks have become more and more powerful, they've also become extremely prominent in financial markets. And I think that makes them inherently political because they're in a position to steer financial rewards to some members of society at the expense of others. And as far as the money functioning in the way it is meant to function on behalf of the people who use it to plan their lives and carry out their daily commerce, I think that that objective has sort of turned into a transformation of money being a tool for the government to utilize to achieve its goals. That is, it's just another economic tool versus this more fundamental purpose of providing people with a dependable store of value and a meaningful unit of account. I'd like to try to restore that prior role to money. And I think that we need to take a look at the impact of the Federal Reserve on economic performance and see if there aren't ways to get us back to a more solid monetary platform. I think you would end up getting much better levels of prosperity. I think the economy would function better. And I think it would prioritize the private sector. I might just end by citing your opening that governments are borrowing so much money, they're really taking all the oxygen out of the room. And we need to let investment resources flow to genuinely productive projects that reflect gains for the real economy, not just the increasing financialization of our gross domestic product.
Now, Judy, you pointed out that the total U.S. federal debt stood at roughly $400 billion in August of 1971, but began rising at an alarming pace during the 80s and the 90s. Then the accumulated debt had reached more than $10 trillion by October 2008. And by March 2020, the federal debt climbed to $23 trillion, and then it skyrocketed to reach more than $34 trillion by the end of 2023. Not to mention, it's nearing $36 trillion now. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the projected 10-year cost of servicing U.S. government debt from 2024 to 2033 had increased to $10.6 trillion, nearly double the original estimate from 2021. So, Dr. Judy, I mean, what are the dangers here if we don't address this right away?
Well, these are staggering numbers. I think the shock for people, unfortunately, we don't stay shocked long enough, but it's come to everyone's attention now that paying the interest on the debt is now costing more in terms of taxpayer revenues that the government receives. It is costing more to finance that debt than to pay for our defense needs. And that should give us some perspective on how out of hand this has gotten. I happen to think that the only solution is really to cut government spending. We have seen increases in revenue, and frankly, I think lowering taxes and lowering regulations does enhance the revenues to the government. This year alone, I think from prior reductions in taxes, we had an 11% increase in revenues, but government spending went up 13%. So yes, growth is very important. Growth is always key to generating those continuing revenues, but it's vital to get the spending under control and to slash significantly.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we know that we have a U.S. election coming up. I mean, it's a very relevant topic, but is there a clock ticking on this debt that we're talking about? I mean, how soon does this need to be addressed?
Well, it's funny you put it that way, because whenever the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, goes before Congress, and he's required to twice a year, in his testimony, he will always say that we are facing a threat of fiscal unsustainability in the long run. But I never hear someone put a date on when are we in the long run. I think it started before today. We're in the long run. So we can't just keep putting this off. I'm hoping that a new administration will take significant steps to trim government, go beyond trimming. I think we have too many bureaucratic layers. I think government's too big in that sense, too many civil servants who are very well intended, but it's just, I think, a basic fact that if you have so many layers of regulation, you end up not giving government services, not providing those services in the most efficient way. So I don't want to just cut the fat, I want to cut the lean. And reevaluate what are the appropriate services that we should expect from government and how can we achieve them much more efficiently.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how the Fed played a role in this. I mean, how many of these decisions that Jerome Powell or the Fed kind of made or have these unintended consequences, if you will?
Well, the Federal Reserve normally would say that it takes no note of its impact in raising rates or lowering rates on fiscal policy. So, I will say that Chair Powell is somewhat unusual in saying that we don't comment on fiscal, we take fiscal as given, because his predecessors, notably Paul Volcker and also Alan Greenspan, did put pressure on the federal budget, that is on Congress and the White House, by saying we cannot have unbalanced budgets going far into the future. We have to address this. Volcker, not long after Ronald Reagan came in 1981, said, I understand you're wanting to cut taxes and you're wanting to cut regulations because we do need to give people incentives to work and save and invest. So he said, you can't move forward without a growth-oriented economic agenda. But then he said, we also have to tackle the government spending side. Alan Greenspan tried to sort of make a more subtle deal and said, we'll give you, the White House, lower rates when you coerce Congress to bring about a balanced budget amendment. I think that was really their agenda. That's when Carville, as a Democrat strategist, used to say, I want to come back as a long-term bond because that's the only thing people care about, that interest rate. And that was a key signal to the Fed under Alan Greenspan. But Jay Powell feels strongly that the Fed should not comment on fiscal issues. So I think the Fed, in the sense it has caused interest rates to go up, that was, of course, that does make it very expensive for the government, as we've just been saying, to finance the debt. But the Fed was a big purchaser of that debt. In some ways, the Fed enabled it. Even after March 2020, I think you use that as a point in time, the Fed purchased $4.5 trillion in additional government guaranteed securities. And so in that sense, the Fed made it a little too easy in the days of zero interest rates for the government to say, we have a much higher debt burden, but it's so cheap to finance, don't worry about it. But now, after it became very expensive to finance, when the Fed raised interest rates 500 basis points, it didn't seem to deter the government from continuing to borrow and continuing to engage in deficit financing. But those high interest rates may have had an impact on the private sector, where higher borrowing costs are a genuine obstacle. So I think the Fed has been complicit with a deficit spending Congress and White House. And now we don't want the Fed to make monetary decisions based on what it costs the government to finance. But I think a lot of people are saying our only way out of this is to inflate away the U.S. government debt, which is certainly a disservice to American citizens who don't like to have their purchasing power eroded out from under them.
Yeah, you'd certainly think so. I'm curious here. Talk to me a little bit about, and to our viewers, about how the Fed's mission came to fruition here. I mean, are they adhering to the original mission that they kind of created? Where are we at?
It depends how far back we want to go in saying original mission. When the Fed was created in 1913, we were still on the gold standard. So there was no issue as far as the Fed has monetary policy. That isn't what determined the money supply. That discipline was inherent because we were still on the international classical gold standard. In those days, the purpose of the Fed was to just provide an elastic currency. Elastic in the sense that as a largely agrarian economy, we had to service farmers, and seasonally, farmers sometimes had great need to borrow for equipment, for seeds, for sowing their crops, and then later in the year at harvest time, they sold their crops for money, and they were able to put cash back into the bank, and it was to smooth out those cycles, which sometimes left banks a little high and dry, and then other times sort of overly full with deposits. And so the Fed was just a way to help smooth that out. It wasn't really until, I would say, 1977 and 78, we had two very powerful acts of legislation that provided the Fed with its famous dual mandate, which was actually a triple mandate. The Fed is supposed to promote stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate long-term rates. We sometimes forget about that part. I'm not sure why, because to me that implies that you would have a normal yield curve. So whenever we have an inverted yield curve, as we do currently, it seems to me the Fed is violating that third part of the mandate. But their emphasis is always on the first two. It's just that the Fed has interpreted the mandate of promoting stable prices. I mean, when you think of price stability, it means you don't have increases in prices.
Right.
That would imply zero inflation. But the Fed says no. Stable prices are if we have 2% inflation every year. So that actually means, and you can go on the Federal Reserve website, go to the St. Louis District Bank of the Federal Reserve System, and they will explain the 2% target rate means that the Fed is deliberately taking measures that will cause your purchasing power to decrease 2% every year. Now, I think that low and perpetual inflation does harm over time to the economy. Just think of a house that you own for 10 years, and the change in its value at the end of that 10 years is significant. It's sort of like, maybe this is a strange example, but tectonic plates and an earthquake. If they were sliding apart 2% a year, and after 10% there was a 20% gap or a change, that to me leads to instability. And I think that it would be much better if the Fed did define stable prices to mean targeting 0%. I mean, if that goes to another question, can they do it? Because the Fed wants to take credit for bringing inflation down from 9% in the summer of 2022 to closer to 2% today. Then why not go all the way? And there are at least three reasons that the Fed will put up for why they want 2% versus 0. But I think we need to examine all three reasons. One is based on money illusion, that people will be happier if their nominal wages go up, even if they're actually getting a decrease in their purchasing power. So a little bit of inflation might camouflage a real loss in purchasing power, even if they got a 1% gain in their nominal wage. I think people are smarter than that. I think we've seen through union bargaining that people are very aware that if their wage gains do not keep up with inflation, they have had purchasing power effectively expropriated by the government through an independent government agency, which is our Federal Reserve. Another reason put up is that if you have some inflation, it gives the Fed more policy space. That is, if the real rate of interest is about 2.5%, which it is historically, if you add another 2% inflation, then that gives the Fed, say, 4.5% to play with before they get down to zero. I don't think the economy benefits when the Fed tries to artificially stimulate the economy. I think it ends up just distorting the value of financial assets, and then it takes us a long time to recover from that. Finally, there's concern that, well, if you ever slipped into deflation, and that's put out as just a huge risk. Well, in China, let's say if you see deflation, it's more a reflection of much deeper, more fundamental economic problems. In the case of China, where the government is way overly involved in managing the economy, a little bit of deflation is really a more natural state. I mean, we know that as you get the advancements of technology and through productivity, that the natural behavior of the price level in general is to come down. You can get phones, laptops, lots of things more cheaply today, better products than when they first were introduced. And many consumer goods, for many of them, that is true. So I think a small amount of deflation is not so bad. And in fact, if the Fed targeted zero, it would still be a mildly inflationary way to conduct monetary policy. So for all those reasons, I think we need to reevaluate that target. And that would be fundamental reform of the way our Federal Reserve currently operates.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of these lessons from the past and how we got there. I mean, in the book, you provided a great analysis of earlier gold standard systems where the dollar value was tied to a tangible asset, of course, providing both domestic and international stability. You outlined the pros and the cons of the classic international gold standard and the Bretton Woods gold exchange standard. Explain to me and the viewers here why you came to the conclusion that the link to gold is vital for the U.S. dollar.
Well, actually, I learned somewhat from Alan Greenspan, who even after 18 years as heading the world's most important central bank, about a year and a half after he left that position in 2000, he left in January 2006. But in 2007, he said on television that he thought the classical international gold standard worked remarkably well. He was a big fan of it. And he had been asked by an interviewer, why do we even need central banks? And he said, that's an interesting question. And then talked about the performance of the global economy when it was on the classical international gold standard from roughly 1880 through World War I, so in the 19-teens. The Bretton Woods system came about in 1944, where you had all the nations, well, all the allied nations who were still fighting the war. In 1944, the war was still going. And so against this backdrop of World War II, the United States wanted to inspire our allies in Europe to keep up the fight. And they had to look forward to a better economic future. They had just come out of the 1930s, which was a very rough period. We had the beggar thy neighbor policies, which means that countries were devaluing their currencies against gold, manipulating their currencies to get an unfair trade advantage. And the natural response to that is to then put tariffs on imports of those goods from countries that are manipulating their currency. And then that led to more devaluation of currencies and this negative spiral where international trade fell, that hurt the participating countries, it hurt their economic performance. And when you have these tensions, they feed social and political tensions as well. That is, the economy can impact world events. So the devastating things that were happening in the 30s, some people think were a factor in starting World War II as people become extremely frustrated. And so the goal was to tell those European allies, we're going to give you something better. And so the United States proposed a system wherein all countries would keep a fixed exchange rate between their currency and the US dollar, and the US dollar would be convertible by those countries, not by US citizens, but by the central banks of those foreign countries that were participating in this Bretton Woods international monetary system. They could redeem excess dollars at the rate of $35 per ounce of gold for gold from the United States. And in a way that brought about some level of discipline, not as strong as under the classical international gold standard, where individuals had the right to convert currency into gold, but it nevertheless provided a level international monetary playing field because it produced this fixed exchange rate environment. And that way, if countries trade with each other or investment flows from one country to another, it's based on genuine market signals. It's not impacted by manipulated currencies that make it look like another country has cheaper products. That really represents an unfair trade advantage. It really supports the principles of international trade that are the basis of the original Adam Smith approach of comparative advantage. That's the real rationale for free trade. It was only after the United States brought about and voted to join this system. We created it essentially. We were the primary architect, but still our Congress had to vote to set up the institutions to oversee it. And that would be the International Monetary Fund. And when that was voted upon and this fixed rate system was put into place, it was only a year or two after that that the United States became a champion for free trade. And then we voted to support the general agreement on tariffs and trade to bring down tariffs.
I want to stick on this gold thing for a second, Dr. Judy, because obviously there's a quote from the book, and I want to read it here. It says, "Why gold? Given that nearly 1/5 of all gold ever mined is held by central banks, with the U.S. holdings far exceeding those of the next three largest gold nations combined, gold provides a logical choice to serve as the reserve asset that provides a benchmark for rational currency relations." I mean, elaborate a little bit here why gold is the best solution to sound money, and give us a little bit of background. I mean, you just kind of got into it, but why gold specifically?
Well, as I say, it doesn't have to be gold. I think that it's important that money be a meaningful unit of account when it goes cross-border. It should be meaningful and dependable through time. But we do live in a world that involves international trade, international finance, and in some ways it's a giant step backward that we don't have this level monetary foundation for evaluating decisions of where to buy and sell goods and services and where to invest. Why should those decisions be so distorted by constantly changing currencies, by the role of the foreign exchange market? I mean, you have 7 or 8 trillion in daily turnover. You have all kinds of hundreds of billions, hundreds of trillions, in fact. If you look at the notional value of the derivatives that are riding on the differential interest rate policies of the world's major central banks, and the impact of currencies when, for example, just look at the European Central Bank. Their target interest rate is 3.56%. For the United States, we're at 4.9, and we just lowered 50 basis points. You have these strange anomalies where less credit-worthy areas or individual countries can borrow more cheaply than the United States. And I think that causes the dollar to be overvalued in a sense, which puts our exporters at a disadvantage. And then when nations exacerbate that by further depreciating, and now that that currency manipulation is mostly carried out through central banks. They know exactly what they're doing when they lower interest rates relative to the dollar and how that will impact trade fairness. So I say, okay, why gold? Well, it turns out that's what most central banks have as their primary reserve asset. It's been a traditional, long-standing bulwark of monetary integrity. You could say it's just residual, but it's interesting that in the 53 years since the United States has had no official link between the dollar and gold, we nevertheless retain 261 million ounces. That's the largest level of official reserves held by any country in the world. And we're seeing central banks upping their purchases of gold in recent years. So it's funny, when I was going through the nomination process, I would have some people cite my commendation of the discipline inherent in gold and the historical connection between gold and monetary systems as being kind of a crank right-wing fringe theory. But sometimes I would share op-ed columns that were asserting these things with Alan Greenspan, who's been a longtime colleague. And I remember his response would be, if gold is such a worthless metal, why does the United States government and all major governments hold so much of it in storage? And so I think we can start with that. I think gold is universally recognized as a form of currency. It's so widely held around the world by individuals as well as companies and governments. It has industrial use. It's used in jewelry. So in that sense, it has intrinsic value. But I'm sure today, even people, I don't want to sound too James Bond-ish, but if you are stranded in a foreign country for military or other reasons and you're trying to buy your way out, having some gold coins is usually key to convincing someone to assist you.
Right. Yeah, a little bit of an insurance policy. Dr. Judy, why did Bretton Woods, why did that system end? I mean, why did we go to the fiat if much of what we're talking about could have kind of taken place? I mean, was it just political?
Well, let me say, please feel free. Just call me Judy.
No, there we go. I will.
Yeah, no, I want you to be comfortable because I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And I'd say it started with, first off, the Bretton Woods system delivered 25 years of excellent economic growth around the world. In France, they called it the 30 glorious years, 30 glorieuses. And for the United States, it's commended. Even under the Obama administration, one of the federal budget documents put out one year included a section that showed how well people did during certain eras. And it happened to coincide exactly with the Bretton Woods era, an epoch that they called the age of shared growth, because we had tremendously productive growth. We had notably declining inequality of wealth and income. You had high participation rate in working. And I think that was indicative of very good economic results. Maybe when we hear talk of making America great again, for many people that might harken back to the 50s and the 60s, which were definitely when the Bretton Woods system was in full force. Mm-hmm. I would say it did become political during the era when the United States was fighting the Vietnam War. So in the late 60s, we had especially a lot of pressure on the budget, running budget deficits. It was also a time of entitlement spending on social programs under President Lyndon Johnson. And the U.S. was inflating. Those inflated dollars were paying for goods overseas. The other countries who were part of the Bretton Woods system were accumulating dollars. So they accused us of exporting our inflation. which was true. We were. And at some point, some of our allies, England and France, said and acted on the privilege they had to trade those dollars in. And as they turned in those dollars, the gold was leaving our country. And by August of 1971, Paul Volcker, who was the Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs at the Treasury Department at the time under President Nixon, went to Camp David with President Nixon and said, we have to close access to the gold window, or they're going to keep taking away the gold, and the system won't work anymore. Right. And we're just getting to a critical level. But Paul Volcker always thought, and he wrote about this subsequently in his books, that we would go back to the Bretton Woods system, but at a revalued rate of convertibility. So Nixon made his speech August 15th, 1971, on a Sunday. He had to interrupt a very popular cowboy show, Bonanza, that day, to tell the American people that we are temporarily ending this system and we're going to build a new international monetary system. That didn't come about because it turned out, and while Americans probably thought, all right, the way it's been framed by President Nixon, his program also included wage and price controls and some other things, but they thought, well, maybe it's for the best. He said other countries and currency speculators are taking advantage of the United States. In any case, for the next year and a half, we tried to set up a new rate. Remember, it was at $35 per ounce of gold. Volcker thought maybe at 39. Then it went to 40. That is the black market rate, we'll say, the market rate for gold and the dollar. Meantime, other countries around the world were calling this the Nixon shock. They thought this was a massive displacement in global financial stability. By February of 73, gold hit $42 an ounce. And at that point, through something called the Smithsonian Agreement, the system was absolutely ended. And that is why today the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department carry our gold holdings as an asset, but they value them at a book value or statutory. Since this came out of that Smithsonian Agreement, the book value is $42.22 per ounce. So with gold at well over $2,700 an ounce, that's quite a windfall profit potentially to be gained between the market value of those gold holdings and the way they are carried and have been carried for 53 years.
But how does the U.S. go about revaluing the gold that it holds here? I mean, to your point, we've seen this shift during the last decade or so, with global central banks deciding to hold more and more gold in their reserves since commencing a buying spree back in 2010. This year, we hit multiple records on the gold front. I think it was last trading at above $27.50 an ounce, a staggering 33% year to date.
This is why I have obviously strong feelings about money being a moral contract. I think our government owes us some money. We have to use our legal tender. And I think that we deserve to have money that fulfills those functions and where value isn't expropriated, where the purchasing power isn't deliberately taken away, where the dollar isn't debased as a function of the Federal Reserve's framework. But I know it's not enough to just rant about how money, in the sense that the founding fathers of America intended it to be regulated. They thought money should be, that Congress should have the power to regulate the money in the same way that Congress had the power to define the official weights and measures for this new country. That is, money was supposed to be an unvarying standard. They even hoped it would become a universal standard, that they would define the dollar in terms of a precise weight of gold and silver, and that would become the dollar that could end up, if America lived up to the dreams of the founders, defining the universal monetary standard. So we've come a long way from that, but what I'm suggesting is that we try to capture some of that windfall gain by not by selling the gold. You could sell it. Gordon Brown did that for England, and most people think it was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made as prime minister. No, don't sell it, because then that money goes down a rat hole. I mean, I think it would be wasted. What I think we need to do is use the value of the gold, use that gold or gold holdings as specific collateral for a new Treasury instrument, a long-term Treasury bond, absolutely collateralized by gold, and audit the gold holdings, definitely audit the gold holdings, assure everyone it's actually there. But that particular instrument that I'm suggesting, so that I'm doing something more concrete than just complaining about our monetary situation today and the need to get back to a sound dollar, I'm saying we should pursue this initiative specifically to have Treasury issue something I'm calling Treasury trust bonds. And someone who buys a Treasury trust bond would have the right at maturity to either take the face value, the dollar denominated face value of that bond, or the pre-specified amount of gold. It would be their option to take either the face value in dollars or this predetermined amount of gold. Because I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that the dollar used to be as good as gold. And there's a lot to be said for having an asset that also functions as money, that really in the future, you still own the same amount of that asset. That is, if you buy an ounce of gold today, 10 years from now, you still own a full ounce of gold. Versus if you have the dollar equivalent today, you know for certain, as a matter of policy, it will be worth, those dollars will be worth substantially less in the future. So I think we need to get back to money being an authentic store of value. And by establishing this instrument, it wouldn't be the largest category of debt security offered by the U.S. Treasury, but it wouldn't be the smallest one either. There was another instrument introduced in 2014 that represents about $600 billion worth of claims against the U.S. government. So it would be larger than that. And what I really think this Treasury trust bond would be most comparable to would be TIPS, the Treasury inflation protected securities, because they also compensate the bondholder for inflation. It's just that they do it by giving a cost of living adjustment to the bondholder, so that a bondholder who's willing to lend money to the U.S. government nevertheless doesn't want to have the interest rate they're getting completely overwhelmed by a loss in purchasing power. So they buy a TIPS bond because they know they'll be compensated for that. Versus on other Treasury instruments, you take your chances. You're bidding based on your estimated impact of future inflation. Right. Well, this would be a similar deal, a similar payoff to the bondholder. It's just that for people interested in Treasury trust bonds, instead of a CPI, a consumer price index determined compensation, they're saying I measure inflation, or say the potential decline in dollar purchasing power based on this commodity. I see gold as a surrogate for the real economy. That's my link to reality. For that bondholder, this is their insurance. This is their guarantee that even if the dollars are worth substantially less in the future, they know they will get back that amount of gold. And so that's determining their return on this loan to the U.S. government.
Yeah, I'm so curious, when it comes to these bonds, you're talking about 50 years. So elaborate a little bit here, Judy, as to what that time frame represents and why. I mean, specifically because we've been talking about this 33% rally just this year in gold. So what does that mean, the 50 years?
Well, at this point, I would say it's somewhat symbolic, and I'll explain in a moment. When I was first thinking of this idea, and this goes back many years for me, I thought maybe these would be 5-year bonds and kind of a pilot program. And then you could do another offering and another offering, and you would just slowly start issuing these depending on how they were received by investors. But now I think what you really, the greater value would be to set up these bonds as a barometer, just as the TIPS bonds allow people, investors, to see what are the aggregate expectations about inflation, and in that sense also perform a vital information role for a consideration of the policymakers at the Federal Reserve. I think that comparing the interest rate on this sort of bond relative to a conventional Treasury security would be very important to see. That is, it would register the level of trust in dollar versus gold. And so now you're tapping into our heritage, into monetary history in general, and as sort of this benchmark level of credibility for any currency that might be convertible into gold. So I think now when I talk about a 50-year bond, as I do in the book, first I'll say some governments already issue 50-year bonds. France does. And when I was working on the transition team for President Trump, I was assigned to Treasury as the lead advisor on international affairs. And I know Treasury was asked to look at 50-year bonds, just really to give another option to bond holders. Just as TIPS bonds came about in 1999 under Robert Rubin. He was the Treasury Secretary. It was just another option for investors who were wary about inflation to be able to choose another instrument. So this would be in the array of Treasury instruments that are put out. We know there are short-term bills and notes and bonds, 20 and 30-year bonds. A 50-year bond to me, since I would like it to have the significance of representing kind of a beachhead, it's kind of a novelty, be the first time in 53, 54 years that the U.S. Treasury would once again provide an instrument that had some gold backing. That's something Ronald Reagan talked about doing. He wanted to make the dollar the most trusted currency in the world. And he said, without some form of gold backing, we won't be able to truly tackle inflation. I think a president could make good on those intentions by pursuing this initiative for Treasury trust bonds. And since we're going back to founding values, I thought, why not introduce this 50-year bond on July 4th, 2026, gives us a little time to prepare for it, and have it mature on July 4th, 2076, because that will be the 300th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence for the United States. And I sometimes think, if you ask someone, do you think the United States will still be here in 50 years? It's troubling that they almost have to think about it. And we hear so much about fiscal unsustainability. And if we're serious, what we mean is that's an existential threat.
Yeah.
Some of my early work at the Hoover Institution at Stanford was on the internal monetary and financial condition of the Soviet Union. And believe me, when I was writing what turned out to be my book on the Soviet economy, I wasn't predicting that the country could collapse. I mean, this was our biggest enemy, the country that could annihilate us with nuclear weapons. And was I really going to suggest they could go bankrupt? I had to, because looking at the numbers with kind of the green eye shades of an accountant mentality, it was clear that the country was not going to be viable going into the future. So I'm not predicting that for the United States, but I'm concerned. I'm concerned that we can't turn our banking system into a utility that just channels credit back to the government to pay for an increasing gap in revenues and expenditures. And yet that's what we're doing. I think a lot of lending is now becoming private because the banks just engage with buying government debt in large part. And that's not what I consider productive investing. And the Fed ends up regulating interest rates, controlling them by paying banks not to make loans to the private sector. This is something that changed after 2008. The Fed was granted an emergency power to pay interest on the reserve balances. See, banks are required to keep an account, a cash account, on deposit at the Federal Reserve, at their local Federal Reserve District Bank. The Fed has found that the easiest way for them to control interest rates is to raise or lower the amount of interest they pay on those cash accounts. So these very, very high rates, over 5%, that the Fed has been paying, just goes to the bank so that the bank then looks at opportunities to make loans to its clients and compares it. It can have a riskless rate of return on a government guaranteed account at the Fed that's quite generous. That's a pretty high threshold for private enterprise to meet, because private enterprise, if it has a hope of being productive or raising living standards, is by definition going to be a risky proposition. That's what entrepreneurialism is all about. So it sets up quite an obstacle for the private sector. And I am concerned about the future of the United States from both a fiscal and monetary point of view. But I'm also concerned at the way fiscal and monetary are working in a way at odds. One is stimulatory fiscal policy, whereas the Fed had been practicing contractionary monetary policy. Of course, that's just changed with this latest jumbo cut. But I think the 1-2 punch of our fiscal and monetary policy has been to enlarge the government sector at the expense of the private sector. And that's not good for the future of the country.
Yeah, certainly not. And I want to come back to this point. I mean, it seems like it's such an important message, because if the U.S. delivers on this bond, I mean, what is the message sent both internationally and domestically, specifically for those countries, for instance, like BRICS, that have been trying to really push this de-dollarization trend?
Well, I'm watching the BRICS efforts as well. Thank goodness Argentina didn't join. There was a lot of pressure on Argentina to join Brazil and Russia and India and China and South Africa and Egypt and the other nations that are part of BRICS. These are not generally our friends, although it's a mixed batch, which makes it concerning, I think, for the United States. But under President Milei, Argentina, which had been slated to join in January this year, opted not to join. We're very fortunate. And I think we should be a very good ally to Argentina, make Argentina great again. But
if only you can help us get that president on our show, Judy.
Well, I'm a great admirer. of Javier Milei, and especially as a monetary scholar. I think he's quite well grounded and very well informed. But what I was going to say about the most recent BRICS monetary summit hosted by Vladimir Putin, I don't think they made much progress on the monetary front. Now, certainly they have a lot of grievances, particularly Russia, who's been hit by sanctions. Russia has largely found its way around those sanctions. But I can see why other governments are concerned that they could likewise be banished from using the SWIFT system, or even have their reserves frozen, something we did to Russia. But if anyone is going to talk about forging fundamental monetary reform, I want it to be the United States. I think being the global reserve currency, the dominant currency, is one of the most powerful aspects of soft power that we can utilize around the world. And I want to maintain that advantage. And I don't want the US to get complacent about the fact that people still do prefer to use the dollar. And as I say, that last BRICS summit, I'm sure was somewhat disappointing and even underwhelming those who might have expected there to be a very strong effort with some aspect of success to displace the dollar. I didn't see that happening, but we cannot just rest on our laurels.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. The former exchequer of the economy in Britain, Kwasi Kwarteng, wrote a New York Times op-ed, I think around 2014, at least 10 years ago, saying we'd really be in trouble if China decided to go on a gold standard, because that would be their way of asserting a new dominance in terms of currency. And China is fast developing their gold exchange platforms that allow countries to export energy to China and then immediately be paid in gold futures. So China has not gone to a gold standard, but they are trying to utilize this market position as a major platform for dealing in gold futures to give them an advantage in trade and investment. And they would love to move in on the dollar. At the International Monetary Fund, China successfully managed to get the yuan as one of the currencies that comprise the, it's an accounting figment of mind, but the SDR, the special drawing right, which is the official monetary unit of account used by the International Monetary Fund. So China is gaining some successes, and I think it would really throw a nice, throw everybody into a loop if it was the United States that said, not only do we have the most preferred dominant reserve currency in the world, but it's now going to be the most trusted, not only by our allies and rivals, but by Americans as well, because I think it would be a very strong sign to U.S. citizens that that their legal tender now has some potential discipline in terms of comparing its performance against the gold-backed dollar.
Yeah, well, I mean, to your point, what about Saudi Arabia, China? They're starting to trade oil in other currencies. I mean, how fast is this playing out?
Well, our relationship with Saudi Arabia is extremely important, and with India. And so I think it's imperative that we handle those relationships very well. In a geopolitical world that is extremely sensitive to economic developments, we just have to be smart and make it worth their while to stick with us. So I think showing a recommitment to strengthening the dollar's credibility as a currency is very important. And I also feel that if the United States were to do this, were to be the country that introduced a gold convertible government sovereign debt instrument, I would like to see other countries emulate us. That could be very interesting. The next highest level holders of gold reserves are Germany, Italy, France. The European Central Bank has considerable gold reserves. So much for people who think that it's cringe right-wing extremism to have gold as a reserve against your currency. Yeah. These other major banks also do around the world. And maybe they would likewise think that they should issue a sovereign bond that's convertible into gold at maturity. Now that could get very interesting, because ultimately I'm talking about international monetary reform. Of course, we have to reconcile the soundness of the dollar both domestically and internationally. We don't have that now. So that would be my initial message, is we're doing it to restore the confidence of American citizens in the soundness of our currency, the dollar. But I also think that if other countries emulated our example and issued long-term bonds that ultimately were redeemable in gold, what you're looking at is a future exchange rate system where the currencies of all these countries can be converted to gold at some level. I mean, it might be in a delimited way over a specific time period, but depending on the demand for these types of instruments and the ability of the private sector to maybe replicate them by combining traditional Treasury securities with private gold futures contracts, you could magnify the impact. And as you got closer to maturity, say on the official sovereign debt instruments convertible into gold, it would be easy to see they are inherently projecting a fixed exchange rate system, because those currencies, the face value in any currency that is convertible into a precise weight of gold means that that instrument is similar and very comparable to the other instruments that have the same parameters issued by other governments. And so there's this inherent fixed exchange rate system that would be developing. And the real difference between the interest rates on those bonds as they grew closer to maturity would be the level of credibility of the government that they are going to make good on their promise. That's why I say these instruments for the United States, and being the first one out there, need to be fully collateralized to the satisfaction of the bondholders. And I think that's a vital aspect of carrying out this proposal.
Yeah, well said. And as you say, Judy, and I quote, taking on the Federal Reserve is no easy task. So, I mean, before we let you go here, can you weigh on what it would take to make this happen? I mean, you put great emphasis on bold leadership. You mentioned that the authority for launching Treasury trust bonds could be assigned to the incoming Treasury Secretary. How do our viewers push for the vision you present today?
Well, let's hope that the incoming Treasury Secretary is working for a president who values an opportunity to make the dollar the most trusted currency in the world. So I think that presumes someone who admires the supply side policies of President Reagan. And we saw that it did happen as an initiative by a Treasury Secretary in 99, as I mentioned, when we got Treasury inflation protected securities. Using gold might bring Congress into this. I think, and let's say we don't get it through the next Treasury Secretary, then I also think this is an important time for Congress to look at reforming the Fed. We have a situation now where people, I think, keep raising the specter of, an authoritarian president could browbeat the Federal Reserve and maybe intimidate them into lowering interest rates at a time when the incoming data wouldn't justify doing that. But I think we should be every bit as concerned about power that has been placed in the hands of our monetary officials, because they claim responsibility for stable prices, for maximum employment. They have very powerful financial levers to move the rate of inflation up or down, to increase or decrease unemployment, to manage the growth of the economy, to stimulate it or to curtail it through restrictive rates. I mean, the Fed is in a position to circumscribe the economic agenda of an incoming president. So the Fed is not the little guy if there's a battle of wills over how to achieve economic objectives. I think an incoming president should be able to reasonably deliver on a promise to cut inflation or reduce mortgage costs, or to increase wage growth, or to bring about economic growth. And I think it's important that we recognize that an elected president should have an economic agenda with hopes that it can actually be fulfilled. And I'm uncomfortable that the Fed is in such a position to undermine the ability of an elected president to carry out his economic agenda. Congress needs to look at whether the Fed should be allowed to have no limits on the amount of government debt it can purchase, no limits on the amount of base money it can create with a keystroke, no limits on the amount of interest payments it can give to commercial banks and money market mutual funds at the expense of taxpayers. I might note, I think that the Fed has become too prominent, too powerful, and in that sense, too political, inherently too political, because it has the power to skew financial rewards to some people and not others. The Fed publishes a survey of the changes in household wealth. And in the last 4 years, we saw a tremendous increase. I think it was 46 trillion to a total of 154 trillion in household wealth. And 62% of that in the last 4 years went to the top 10%, if you're looking at the wealth income percentiles. Now, it's grievances over that really fuel the kind of tensions that prompt people to demand change through presidential elections. And I think it's important that the Fed, which has daily influence over the performance of equity markets, is responsible for increasing wealth inequality, because soaring stock prices overwhelmingly accrue to the benefit of those who already own financial assets. And I think the money has to work the same for everyone. I think it's very unhealthy if people feel that the central bank practices monetary favoritism. So it's really to preserve institutions that I think we need to engage in genuine reform of them.
Yeah, well said. And of course, hard assets, they don't really hurt anybody, huh? Dr. Judy Shelton, we'll call you Judy, is a monetary economist and senior fellow at the Independent Institute. Also the author of the new book, Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. Timely, fantastic conversation. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Judy Shelton, of course, from Virginia. I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it, and I respect your audience.
I appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. I hope so. And everyone, go out and vote as well. I'm Jeremy Szafron for all of us here at Kitco News. We want to thank you for watching. We got great content coming up all week long. And as I mentioned with Dr. Judy Shelton, we're also going into election time in the U.S. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.
This Kitco News interview is brought to you by Goldback, inflation-resistant, 24-karat gold currency. Protect your purchasing power, grow your wealth annually, and spend at over 2,000 businesses. Learn where to get Goldbacks at goldback.com.